Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. My name is Gloria McClellan, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar. Our webinar topic today is COVID Influence Talent Acquisition and Workforce Strategy, and today's webinar is hosted by VeriKlick. Before we begin our webinar today, I have a few housekeeping items to cover. The instructions on how to adjust your audio are right here for your view. All attendees will be on mute throughout the webinar. Next, these are your instructions for questions. So these are the instructions for submitting a question in the Q&A section. We would really like to hear from you and like to include you in the conversation. So we really do encourage you to use the Q&A panel and post a question at any time during the webinar. Now, I'd like to begin our webinar by introducing our host and guest panelists. Our host today is Monique Bergener, who is our Senior Director, MSP, VMS Client Management at VeriKlick. And our guest panelist today is Fayez Nathoo, who's our Global Head of Contingent Workforce Management at Marsh & McLennan. So welcome everyone to the webinar. Now I'd like to take just a few moments and introduce and give you an overview of Fayez's career experience. So Fayez is currently the Global Head of Contingent Workforce Management at Marsh & McLennan, the world's leading professional service firm in the areas of risk, strategy, and people. In addition to overseeing the contingent workforce program, ensuring compliance to internal policies and various global external regulatory requirements, he's also responsible for managing the vendor relationships with the firm's MSPs, VMS, and RPO partners. With over 25 years of experience, Fayez is able to combine his experience from procurement and talent acquisition to deliver a people-first solution. So welcome, Fayez. We are really excited to have you with us today.
Hello, Gloria.
Hello. So now let's go ahead and begin our webinar with an important and very well-timed topic, COVID Influence Talent Acquisition and Workforce Strategy. So Monique, I am going to turn this over to you now to begin the discussion.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and we're excited to have Fayez join our webinar with us today. Thank you so much, Fayez.
Thanks for having me, Monique.
It's our pleasure. It's our pleasure. So we've been experiencing this, the remnants of this topic for the past year with COVID and how it's been affecting everyone and every industry. So I'd like to chat with you about this, the reflections and the future based on what we've experienced with COVID. So specifically with regards to the industries that we were involved in, tell me, how did the resourcing strategies change, in your opinion, with the onset of lockdown, and what has changed since?
Oh, that's a really good question, Monique. I think if we look over the last 13 months of us being in pandemic world, the resourcing strategies for firms has probably gone through several different iterations, right? I think when we first started at lockdown, initially it was supposed to be for a few weeks, and then a couple of months, and then it just dragged on where we are today. But at the onset, I think firms started to put a pause on some of their resourcing, and by firms, I'm really going to be talking about some of the professional services firms out there, like Marsh & McLennan, Deloitte, PwCs of the world, and some of the financial services institutions, where there is a large number of recruitment staff and the need to hire people, right? So I think the first couple of weeks, people are trying to assess what they're going to do. We went into lockdown for a couple of weeks, as I mentioned. They didn't know what was going on, right? So it was a wait and see. It's only after a few weeks that we realized we're going to shift to a work from home, because this lockdown is not just 2 weeks or 2 months. It's TBD, right? So how do you resource? How do you change your strategies for something that's to be determined? And if you look at the way firms started to pay attention to not just how they recruited, but also how they staffed for the recruitment. Both of those changed, right? So some firms slowed down recruiting on both the contingent side and the permanent side. And as a result, had to pare down some of their sourcing strategies or resourcing strategies internally. And then for those that had recruitment still going on, the question was, how do we now implement or operationalize interviewing, and how do we change the candidate experience and still keep it as enjoyable a process? Because at the end of the day, recruitment is still one of the first steps or the first foray of that candidate who becomes a worker at that firm.
Right. Right. And it's interesting that you should say that, because, you know, we're all experiencing a different variation of what's happening, and different companies are obviously, you know, taking their own course based on their opinions and needs. So in your opinion, would you say, Fayez, you know, have companies, you know, did companies reevaluate these strategies when it became clear that this was going to be something longer term, you know, and we had to plan for a more of a future versus what we're doing today, but thinking about what are we doing next month and next several months? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's another interesting point. So I think firms started to look internally as well, right? What do we do if we can't start hiring people, if we can't hire at the same rate we were hiring before? Because at the end of the day, a lot in professional services and investment banking and the like in asset management firms, revenues started to dip, right? Because you're no longer able to service or sell services to potential clients or existing clients. So a lot of firms started saying, okay, I may not need to deal with projects A, B, and C today, right? Even though they're on our roadmap, we'll delay them by, let's say, 6 months to a year. And then the projects that were longer term or down the road, that were internal-led projects or infrastructure-led projects that can be done with existing staff or a little bit of staff augmentation. I think a lot of firms started to do that. Right? They brought some projects forward, put others on hold, and then changed their strategy for some of that. And I think you see a lot of firms who wouldn't have necessarily have done the things they've done right now in terms of infrastructure changes have gone ahead and done them now. They say mother is or necessity is a mother of invention, right? I was talking to a friend of mine who happens to be a doctor, and in the early days, they were talking about business as usual, and then it went to, we have to go to telehealth, right?
Right.
But some firms, some places weren't ready for that. And when you look at their roadmap from an infrastructure perspective, they weren't looking to implement remote telehealth programs for another 2 to 3 years, because that's how long it would have taken them to get all the approvals for some of the video capabilities, the more secure channels other than just Zoom, to do the analysis and to meet with their patients. And lo and behold, because of COVID, that necessitated them to be remote. A lot of these projects got fast-tracked.
Right.
And next thing you know, they're in production in 3 months rather than 2 to 3 years down the road.
Funny how these things happen.
Right. I think it came down to, how do we survive? How do we go forward? And how do we still maintain integrity and ensure that we are still fit for purpose once we come out of this? And
Right,
it's no
right.
different than the recruiting strategy. It's what do we need today? What do we need tomorrow? And then at each checkpoint, I'd say people were starting to reevaluate what that meant for their future in terms of strategies for hiring. And some of them got pushed back. And I think it was late summer, early fall where they started to think about 2021 and beyond, right? And then readjust their strategies. And I know a lot of firms right now, when they hit January, February, their recruitment efforts started to go up on both the perm and the contingent side. Now there are some who never slowed down, right? Some of the banks who still had personnel out there on the front line, some of them never changed, right? So if they had a dip, it was minor or marginal. Other firms that are in the distribution, which I'm not well versed on, except from the fact that I've kept up with reading and talked to some colleagues, some of the distribution firms actually hired a lot more people. Your Amazons of
Absolutely.
the world, Walmart changed their strategy, Target's changed their strategy, or they doubled down on what they were already going to do.
They sure did. Yeah.
You look at firms like we were talking about grocery stores earlier on, right, Monique? And one of the nicer ones out in Jersey and Maryland, they changed their strategy from offering longer hours, shorter hours, staff. They upstaffed for cleaning requirements, et cetera. So I think a lot of changes happen across all kinds of industries.
That's true. And obviously with and you have touched on our next point, how did the recruitment team and their efforts change? Clearly they have, and as you just described, Fayez. However, from a staffing partner perspective, and the activity that you've experienced within your organization, we clearly had a, hey, let's figure this out. Let's get an idea of what's happening. And then all of a sudden the trickle and going forward. And then suddenly when we came to realize that this wasn't changing anywhere in the near future, full steam ahead. How has that changed from an enterprise standpoint? In your opinion, and working with the staffing suppliers, what do you think they've done differently? How has that changed?
So, one of the other things that changed in terms of recruitment strategies, which will lead into the question you just asked, Monique, is back in the day, I remember hiring managers would have a list of 5, 6, 10, 12, 20 different criteria, different points that they wanted in a candidate, right? And most often than not, location was always there. They have to be near, they have to be close by, they have to be in the same time zone. And often those are non-negotiables, and the recruitment team would go back and say, we've got the perfect candidate, but they're not really close by, right? They're at the other end of the country or in a different state. And there'd be some back and forth on that. Well, with most firms having to work from home, those are one of the criteria that went out the window. And so how staffing firms have helped, at least in the contingent space, is also help identify those candidates that may not necessarily have to be in the state that the hiring manager is in, or in the country that the hiring manager is in.
Right.
Right. So there's the option now, or the possibility of getting a wider pool of candidates. And that also meant for some firms that lent very nicely into accelerating their diversity and inclusion strategies.
Mm-hmm.
In the past, and it may still continue right now, but previously, pre-COVID, where location was a big criteria, a big point, a lot of the D&I initiatives would stall because someone wanted somebody in yesterday. And the reality is when you're looking for a more diverse workforce, that takes a little bit longer, right?
Right.
Because that diverse candidate may not necessarily be in the same state that hiring manager is in. Not saying that they don't exist, to the contrary, but they may not be in the same location.
Right.
They may be in a different part of the world. They may be somewhere else, right? And then I think this allowed or allows for that strategy to be implemented or executed. And I think staffing firms are now able to actually use the non-geography limitation to be able to provide that. I've also seen, some partners be, or some suppliers be real partners because they understood that it's not just firm A and firm B that have slowed down in the recruiting world. It's almost all of their industry-led or in similar industry type clients have all slowed down. And so what do? They either refocus on other industries where they can provide talent, suitable talent, or they start planning and strategizing with their clients for the long game. I think the ones that did that are the ones that the firms are going to continue working with on a regular basis, rather than those firms who try to capitalize or jump in on, we can get you somebody for this particular location, or we can get you somebody here, but not really want to participate in the program itself, right? And I call those mercenary suppliers who are in there for that moment only, and then gone tomorrow when you say, well, we actually need your help to do A, B, and C.
Right.
And they're not interested, right?
Well, you touched on, Fayez, how the candidate search changed over this last year. Clearly, we're able to have a wider group, a more diverse group, and how the supplier base is working to change and react with that. But I'd like to touch on that topic, though. The candidate base is definitely much more diverse, and this is solely based on a hiring manager's needs. So they are more likely or more able to work with a virtual team because they're virtual themselves at this point. But there's always that hypothetical, when will we go back on site? Will we go back on site, and how will that look? And then what about the candidate base that you're bringing in that is virtual, that perhaps might have interest in coming on site, but truly at the end of the day does not want to go on site? What do you do? What do you do with that, and how does that search affect? How does that affect the search and so forth?
I mean, that's another good point, right? We all know right now during COVID, most of the firms we're talking about are work from home, work remote. But there are certain types of roles that, while they have gone remote, are not necessarily suited or suitable for being in a remote location, right? If I look at certain types of roles, and by suitable, I mean unless you have all the same type of setup and discipline at your remote location, be it at home or a WeWork location, what have you, may still not work very well. And then I look at some call center type roles where the individuals have to be at their desk or at their computer by a phone between a certain set hours. There's no way about that's their job definition, that between 8 and 3 they will be taking calls. They can't mind their dog. They can't really go and take care of their children when they're running, because a phone call comes in, they have to take it, right? So they need that discipline. They need that quiet location that's replicated from an office back at their home. Other types of roles are more suitable, right? Some of the professional services type roles we can do at 11 p.m. at night local time, or at 6 p.m. local time. No different than being 9 to 5 for the most part, depending on what the activities entail. So there's flexibility in some roles, but not in other roles. And so I don't think, I mean, when you say, well, what happens when a worker no longer wants to go into the office, I mean, I think that's a more complicated question, is what's the role, what does a role require? And if it can be emulated somewhere else, then fine, that's up to the company to decide their strategy. The roles that can't or shouldn't be continued from home, that's a different conversation. And I think a lot of firms are reevaluating that as a strategy as well.
Right. And how do you feel the supplier base is reacting to that?
I mean, I think it's almost a red herring of a question. I think the supplier base is getting not necessarily mixed messages, but the messages they get, it's at the behest of their client, right? So that's always going to be a question. If you find this perfect candidate for you, are you willing to accept that they work from home or remotely indefinitely? And for a lot of firms, that question depends on the role itself, because there will be a time when return to an office type structure is reintroduced, right? What that looks like for a lot of the roles, I don't know. Some firms are saying we're all going back to the office as of this date here, right? Other firms are saying, well, we may not need to go back to the office for everybody. And for some people, they've gotten used to it. They've seen the merits and the benefits of having worked remote. They can get the job done. They can mind their dogs and their families and their children from home and do both. And for others, it's, thank God I don't have to take a 2-hour commute into the office every day each way. But I do want to get out. I do want to go see my colleagues.
Right.
At some point. So some people will be looking for a hybrid type setup. And it's not done, that kind of decision isn't done lightly, and it can't be done without taking into a lot of other things into consideration, right? The role itself being one of the primary ones, but other things like tax implications, right? I think that's one of the biggest things that workers forget, is that while 2020 was an anomalous year, there are still huge tax implications from
That's correct.
for working in a different location than you were before. And it gets even more complicated with people who work in one state, used to live in another state, but now are in a third state, who've gotten away because they said, you know what, I'm going to try to get away from New Jersey for 6 months, even though my firm is in New York, but I'm going to go to Vermont for 3 or 4 months. Well, there's tax implications of that. It's not as free will as people make it out to be when you're crossing state lines. So there's those complications as well that people and their employer need to think about.
It certainly trickles down, doesn't it? It really does.
There's a lot of moving parts, Monique, and I don't think everybody's fully aware of what those moving parts are always. Some are, but I don't think it always enters into people's consciousness. It's like, you know what, I'm going to pick up and go somewhere else.
Right.
Because what's the difference from a delivering a work? There may not be a difference, but we don't just work in a country that allows necessarily that kind of mobility, because incomes and taxes are state run.
Absolutely. And to that point, hypothetically, if I thought, well, I could work from the beach and that puts me in another state, hypothetically, I may not think about it because I'm still doing my job. I'm still delivering what I need to deliver. So that doesn't change. And if I don't say anything, if I don't tell anyone, then how are we going to know? And then how does that catch up with me in the future if I haven't disclosed that? Or, so there, again, it's a much larger conversation. I agree with you.
Yeah, that disclosure is another big area, right? If I don't tell anybody, does anybody know?
And then how does that affect me later? So,
and your employer.
Exactly, exactly. So, I'd be curious to know, we're a year into COVID at this point, and compared to when this all started, and then even only 6 months ago or so, what do you see at this point going forward? What do you see in terms of changes that are upcoming? And then do you think that these changes perhaps are here to stay, or will we go back in any way, shape, or form to the old norm pre-COVID?
I think people like to take, people like to look at things that they've done and done well. Everyone likes doing postmortems and benefits of where they are today and marry them up to see how can I do this better tomorrow, right? And from that perspective, I think we're going to see a lot more, wherever it's possible, a hybrid type. So you take the best of what was there for you last year during COVID, because in every crisis there's always a silver lining, and then I think people liked or enjoyed some of those benefits. I don't necessarily think for the professional firms out there is going full back to where we were, March 1st or February 28th last year before going to lockdown, because those days are gone, in the sense that the environment has changed. People know they can work remote. People enjoyed spending time with their family, at least, or spending time at the beach, and having missed their colleagues at work. Yeah, they want to go back, but they don't want to go back for a full week anymore. So I think people will look at a hybrid or a blended model going forward wherever they can. And then firms and employers are going to be looking at their real estate portfolio, right? If we're only going to be in office at 40%, do we need this much office space in Manhattan?
Right.
And so I think firms are going to be grappling with that as well over the next several years. Is what do we do? Do we
Yeah,
need
the
to be?
cost factor, the savings, the unnecessary expense, cafeterias, facilities, electricity, utilities, you name it. I mean, it's amazing, isn't it, Fayez?
It's like I said, there's so many different components to this that it would take more than just this webinar to go over all of the possibilities. But I think and then there's some businesses or industries where that's just not possible, right, Monique? Like a restaurant is a restaurant.
Right.
Distribution center is a distribution center. Trucking is trucking. But other ones where you can play with, or you can be in a different model, I think firms will start to embrace that.
Mm-hmm. So, and there are really some really good points. I will say, Fayez, that I do have a couple of questions that have come in, if I may ask. One of which has we've already discussed, how has all of this affected your hiring managers, if it has? So I know we talked about that, and the hiring managers are adapting and so on and so forth, but I at least wanted to address that one question quickly. But here's the one that we haven't touched per se. Given your global position, what differences or impacts have you experienced globally with suppliers, global team members, and so forth? And are there any commonalities, Fayez, based on what we've experienced in North America? And if so, what are they, and how are they unique, if you can share with us?
Well, I think the world over, everyone is going through pretty much the same thing, varying degrees of lockdowns and severities, right? Some
Mm-hmm.
locations like Australia, where they took care of things in a very stringent manner up front, are now reaping more of the benefits today because they can open up, go to the office, go to the beach, hang out with friends, colleagues, much more looser, much more easier than, say, colleagues here in the US. Right?
Mhm.
It's a different mentality, it's a different social consciousness in terms of how do we deal with and how do we grapple this pandemic. And then that definitely plays into, well, I can go back to the office now, right? And that changes mentalities and people's way of working. Having said that, the commonalities are still the same, right? The COVID is still a highly transmittable virus with potentially devastating effects.
Right.
And not everybody is comfortable taking that commute in places where it's just moderately under control or where things are opening up again. And I think that comes down to a personal choice. And firms, most of the large firms recognize that we can't really force, or we shouldn't be really forcing our greatest asset, which are people, into making uncomfortable decisions or choices where they can't be mitigated, right? So you open up your office and say, we're open for business. But if getting to the office means taking public transport with people who aren't necessarily adhering to the protocols required, or haven't been fully vaccinated or fully protective, then is that something that everybody will want to do?
Right. Right.
And that theme is worldwide. Some places have opened up stadiums, and is that something? Yes, I know people are egging to get out, but I think some people recognize that doing this is going to actually set us back, and we don't want that, and so they'll stay away. And others are like, you know what, I'm going to carry on and continue my life as it is, and that's a personal choice. But those personal choices affect other people, and some people are more sensitive to that than others.
Right. Right. It's interesting. I do have another question. I have several actually. Have you experienced suppliers voluntarily leave your program or not respond timely due to any changes in your volume of requisitions that may have been affected by COVID?
Yeah, don't let the door hit you on your way out. Yeah, some suppliers have done that. And the reality is that if they did do that, then depending on the real reasons why, if they're saying, well, the volume has dropped, so we don't really want to support your program, they weren't really a partner to begin with, right? So I would not have been disappointed to see them go. The
Okay.
reality is that's not what happened in my program.
Of course.
Were
You have a
it to
fabulous
happen,
program.
say that again?
I said you have a fabulous program.
Well, that's neither here nor there, but I appreciate that, Monique, because you're one of our suppliers. What I was trying to say is, if that situation happened and a supplier said, see ya, I don't think I'd be disappointed in them leaving. But the reality is, it was quite the opposite. All our suppliers were full force and effect saying, how can we help? What do you need from us? Whatever you get, let us know. If you can help fill the roles, we'll do that. If not, we'll stay. We're there, right? And I think those partners were great to have. Others
Right.
stepped up and said, hey, you know what? We can help you accomplish or achieve these goals, and we'll bring these ideas over to you, right? While we have this lull. And that was well appreciated, right? Especially in the D&I space, especially in looking at how do we change perspectives and how do we change from A to B. A handful of suppliers came to me and said, hey, can we just have a conversation about this? This is what I'm doing with this client. This is what we're looking at. We've written this white paper. We want you to be part of this. Right? Those are the suppliers you think down the road, yes, these are my partners. They're not just suppliers who I do business with because a rec comes in and goes out. These are people I talk to, which is nice to see, right? And then there was the extreme element of those suppliers who are not in the program, who had a lot of free time on their hands because they're losing business or not having more rec volume somewhere else, trying to fill that void by trying to sign up to our program.
Right.
But not having the rec volume to give them, it's not necessarily it wouldn't have been fair for me to open up my program to new suppliers when I already had suppliers who are sticking with me through thick and thin, and whatever rec volume I have, I'd rather give to them, unless it was an absolute niche role, which I had to go outside the program for to get another supplier in the program. The reality is, you do well by me, I'll do well by you.
Right. Understood. No, that makes perfectly good sense. Another question is, have there been any changes with your technology platforms to address the changes due to COVID?
Absolutely. That's a good question. And one we could have addressed earlier on. Yes. So everything changed. When Marsh McLennan moved everything remote, we had to not just change our technology, right, or at least to bolster our infrastructure, but we had to get logistics involved as well, right? So where we were sending out laptops or people collecting their laptops in the office, this now meant getting laptops out to everybody, getting the laptops in, configuring them, and then getting them out in a faster time period, right? Because we need to get both perm and contingent workers working at the earliest opportunity. So that part changed, the logistics changed, procurement changed in getting those the equipment in. Interview technologies changed, right? There was no longer in-person interviews. Everything moved to phone or Zoom or whatever video platform.
Right.
And in order to support that, because everything is going through the corporate infrastructure, that needed to be bolstered. You go from any given time for us, we're 76,000 people globally, over 130 countries, right? Some countries being heavier than others. The strain on our data centers and infrastructure was incredible the first week, right? So we had to change access, we had to change our technology to log into the firm under secure protocols. All that had to be done, and had to be done fast and quick and early.
Right. And clean. It had to be clean because
clean. Yeah, there's no room for mistakes.
What if you email a laptop to the wrong location?
Which happens because somebody who decided that their permanent address was New York City at one point, and they decided to go to Rehoboth Beach, not tell anybody. Well, you'll get those happening.
By the way, send it to my friend's house.
Exactly, right? So that all had to be accounted for. Data privacy issues still need to be accounted for because you can't have those addresses being thrown around left, right, and center. So a lot of considerations had to happen. Plus, you had, your internal information security team involved as well because of cyber crimes and the opportunity for cyber stalking and intrusions started to go up. So again, a lot of moving parts to deal with just working from home. And that doesn't even talk about the person who is working from home having to potentially upgrade their infrastructure at home, right? Some roles, if you're on Zoom every day on a laptop with your phone and with one other, with your kids or your partner or whomever streaming television shows,
I know.
that requires a lot of bandwidth.
It sure does. It sure does. I do have another question, and so far it looks like this might be the final question, but team brainstorming office sessions has always been a huge benefit in resolving challenges or developing new ideas and processes and so forth. As a program leader, have you experienced any challenges being remote versus in an office with your teams and the ability to collaborate with your group given the new situation? And if so, what have you done to change? What have you changed that would continue to, you know, to move forward with that modified world of meetings and collaboration and work?
You know, nothing takes the place of an in-person interaction, whether it's with a new stakeholder, and implementing a new program, or even working with your own team, right? So that's a given. It's far more, it may not necessarily be more productive on a ROI basis, at least on the surface, but I think deep down, everybody knows that they are beneficial, right? Just that person-to-person contact, the body language, the ability to write on a whiteboard, get your notes down, and then go for that pint after work. How does that change in a remote setting? It's hard. It's harder. And I think a lot of people have tried to bring what they did in the office to their remote sessions. Some more successful than others. You know, people early on tried having happy hours at certain points of the day or evening with their colleagues. It's kind of hard to have a happy hour when you're wearing a headset or you're on your phone having it ring to a camera, or having to set that up. But people made the best of it, right? And I think we're at a point where we've now gotten used to setting time aside and dealing with your team members and trying to do it on the Zoom. You can make it as fun as you want. And it's not necessarily, it may not necessarily be the same thing. We know that, but there are ways you can make it come close to it, right? It's harder with a larger group of people. So if it's a smaller number, you can probably manage it a little bit better. Just, you know, trying to manage 50 people on a Zoom, trying to team build, or 10 people versus 5 people, right? And then it depends on personal situations, etc. But I think
Right.
trying
And
to
I'd
make
like
that
to
contact is still important.
absolutely. And I'd like to segue into one other question, final question, if I may. On that same topic, working remotely and in collaboration, have you found that there have been any challenges from a worker standpoint, whether they are individuals that are new to the organization that should be strong, perhaps are stronger in a face-to-face on-site scenario versus a remote scenario, or those that were previously on site, currently in place, as suddenly are now in a remote scenario? Are you finding that there any is there a decline in performance or the appearance of performance or teamwork as a result of being off, remote? Because just some people can't work remotely as well as being on site.
No, exactly. So I think that's one of the challenges, right? And I think we spoke about this on another occasion, where for some, working remote has been a blessing from a personal delivery perspective, because they can focus more. There's no other distractions, and they can just hunker down and work. Whereas for others, there's too many distractions, right? And for others, it's a matter of managing the distractions and trying to do the best they can given the flexibility they have. So while they're distracted between 12 and 3, they can actually do work between 6 and 9. So what's happened is the workday for a lot of people has shifted. It's become longer, so the 2 or 4 hour commute time from Jersey to New York for some people, where while they're saving that time traveling, they find that their work is becoming or starting a lot earlier and ending a lot later. right?
Right.
You know, I rolling out a program in Australia, expanding my MSP program there, and in any other time I would have been there in person, right? Meeting my stakeholders,
Right.
delivering presentations in person, etc. It makes it a lot easier. Instead, now I find myself working until 11, 12 p.m. because that's the time zone I need to cater to, right? And then reality check, I have to cater to my US based clientele and my UK based team. So I'm up and working at 6, right? So I go from 6 to 12 with a few, moments of breaks here and there. But people's work habits and work schedules have changed as a result of being at home or working remote. That is
Absolutely.
reality. And one thing that hadn't always been addressed, but this is a good segue into it, is people's mental well-being.
Absolutely.
There's a toll that humans end up taking on being remote or isolated from people, their friends, their colleagues. I think those are the people who, when you're talking about some people can flourish working from home and others may not, there's an element of social interactions where some people suffer more from it than others do. I think everybody will, to a certain degree, feel its impact, but there are some people who are more susceptible to it than others are.
True. Interesting. It's such an interesting topic, Fayez, and we could truly talk for hours about this. There's so many different facets and areas that we can continue forward, and I would love to. However, I do want to be mindful of our time. We've been very fortunate to receive some fabulous questions, and thank you very much for responding to those. But with that, I am thrilled and I'm just privileged to have you on our call today. And thank you so much, Fayez, for everything. I will now hand it over to Gloria to close out. But Fayez, it's been a distinct pleasure. Thank you so much for your efforts.
Thank you, Monique.
So, Monique, Fayez, what a great, open, and authentic discussion. Such a relevant topic for all of us. So, thank you so much for sharing everything. So, a sincere thank you, Monique, as always, to you for hosting and guiding the discussion. And Fayez, a very special thank you, for sharing your thoughts about this topic, your experience and your journey, and thoughts about next steps. So thank you very, very much to both of you. And I'm hoping that everyone in our attendee and audience enjoyed today's topic and discussion, and want to thank you for attending and participating today and appreciate the questions as well. So VeriKlick is going to continue to be hosting additional webinars monthly throughout the year. And again, we hope that you will follow us and attend our future webinars. We have some impressive guests and relevant topics planned that you're going to find quite interesting and informative as we continue our journey into 2021. And our next webinar is scheduled in May, so keep your eyes open and keep abreast of LinkedIn. We'll be socializing that very soon. And also, you're going to receive a survey at the conclusion of the webinar, and we would appreciate it if you could take just a few moments and provide us with your valuable feedback. We look to that and helping guide us make improvements and in enhancing what we're doing and et cetera through the course of time. So a special thank you to all of you for joining us today for this webinar. My name is Gloria McLennan, and on behalf of VeriKlick and our guest today, Fayez Nathoo, have a great day.